I don't have a proper presentation. I'm just going to speak to some of my notes, and I think that Joe has put a really nice context to the points that I want to raise. I want to start with the question that Christabel asked, is the South African or the Department of Home Affairs here in this part of the world, is its policy and implementation and how it responds to migration and refugees, does it uphold human dignity? And my answer in one word is no. I think that I will speak to the policy changes that are taking place in our country. I think other speakers have made mention of the fact that the South African Constitution is one of the most progressive in the world. And the Bill of Rights enforces respect for human rights and human dignity, basic human rights for all who live in South Africa, not citizen-based. It is your right to education, your right to healthcare, and we are seeing on a daily basis that this right is being trampled upon. I think the shifts in policy are showing more and more a very unholy alliance between what is taking place in Australia, with Trump in America, and a similar direction in South Africa. While we have one of the most progressive policies on refugees, the Refugee Bill, and this year marks 20 years, I think, since it was promulgated, the amendments to that bill are moving in exactly the same direction of calling for processing centers, and more we are seeing, as within the US and with Australia, and to a certain extent in Europe, the use of detention to manage migration. And that then raises questions about the conditions of detention and the inhumane conditions that undocumented migrants, people coming to this region that are living under. So in a word, what we are seeing is that while the Constitution, which is not only championing human rights and human dignity, this document was written with the understanding and enforcing the need for redress for our past. And if you look at just the question of migrant labor, and Joe mentioned this, the mining companies exploited black migrant labor to make the profits that they did. And one consequence, which is unchallenged, which has mountains of research, demonstrates that it is the conditions that workers lived under that directly fueled the TB epidemic and the HIV epidemic that we are still reeling from in this region. And I think Joe has spoken extensively on why we need to have a regional approach to dealing with and bringing under control communicable diseases like HIV and TB. And that's one of the reasons why, in pushing people underground, that we will not come to bring those diseases under control. So it's logical to have an approach that respects human rights and human dignity. And my one question, I'm not going to go into this, but I do think that we need to reflect and understand how West Africa managed to deal with its Ebola crisis. I think there were problems with the WHO reaction and with the way the international community reacted, but that region largely came to bring that disease under control because of the free movement of people, the ability to do education, the ability to keep a respect for human dignity and human rights that eventually brought it. The length was more the failure to respond. So those are just my opening comments, and I think I'm going to just speak very quickly to the very sad situation in our country with respect to how we treat foreign nationals broadly and refugees and migrants more specifically. The mantra from our government, and ironically, is that there's too much of human rights. And this comes directly from the Department of Home Affairs. So I am laying responsibility on our government and on the Department of Home Affairs that our constitution and our refugee policy grants too many rights, and that's why we are flooded. And this word flooded, as Joe has pointed out, we need to debunk this. Where is the floods? Where are the masses of people? There's no substantiation, there's no references to research to prove that this is the situation in our country. My second point is just broadly the two policy documents that we need to study and look at is, as I said, the amendments to the Refugee Bill. And through our advocacy and lobbying, we know that over 1,000 submissions were made calling for the withdrawal of these amendments. And those submissions were ignored. And we gave long substantiation to why these amendments should be withdrawn, because we had at the same time the Green Paper on International Migration, and which is currently the White Paper on International Migration. Now, I think I will speak a bit to the White Paper on International Migration because I think it is schizophrenic, but it has incredibly progressive elements to it that we need to be able to promote and champion for the implementation and enforcement by our government. We can't talk about migration in this region without looking at the failed asylum system in our country. And in a presentation to the Human Rights Commission, when they were looking at a hearing on xenophobia, the Lawyers for Human Rights submission framed our asylum process and accused our Department of Home Affairs of being guilty of institutionalized xenophobia in the practice and in how people seeking asylum in our country are treated. Just to give you a sober analysis of the statistics, because you would have heard that there's millions of people coming, flooding our country. The statistics, according the most recent, I think 2016, according to the Department of Home Affairs, is that there are approximately 200,000 asylum seekers in our country, and there are 90,000 recognized refugees. Now, if you do the maths and compare that to Uganda, to Kenya, to other countries on our continent, that just is insignificant. And so it's not that we are being flooded with people. I think there's a very important statement that Dr. Fatima Khan, the director of the Refugee Rights Clinic at the University of Cape Town, she wrote an open letter to President Cyril Ramaphosa when he got elected in December. And she made an appeal, and I'm just going to give it to you as a reference for you to go and look at, because I think that letter points out the sad situation in our country with respect to what the implications of the amendments to the Refugee Act and its disregard for international laws, but more importantly, and which our country has ratified, as many have pointed out, but it also is unconstitutional. And that's the key point around the changes. There's disrespect for basic human rights, disrespect for human dignity. And what we are seeing is that the way in which asylum seekers and how it's managed in this country is that there's widespread corruption. And I think we can speak volumes. LHR has documented what is happening at what is now called the Desmond Tutu Refugee Reception Office, just endemic, systemic corruption. You cannot get a stamp, you cannot get access unless you pay some form of corruption. And there's mental abuse in the way that people are treated, and there's also a failure to assist people. The statistics since I think 2015, and Roshan will correct me if I'm wrong, has been that there is a 96% rejection rate of all applications for a refugee status in our country. And if you look at what's happening on the continent, there's some disjuncture there, there's something that's not right. In the Refugee Reception Office in Musina, you have a 100% rejection rate. Now what is going on? Why is there's a crisis? Coming back to the White Paper on International Migration, the two important points to note is that this White Paper, and we welcome this, because this is why we called for the withdrawal of the amendments to the Refugee Bill, is that migration must be dealt with in a holistic manner, including both issues of immigration, emigration, and asylum in one policy. And up to now, it's been fragmented, and we don't, that would, I think, assist in ensuring that our approach is comprehensive and that we manage it in a way that is in keeping with both our constitution, but also what South Africa has been held in high regard in the world is that, you know, our democratic dispensation came about through a peaceful means. We overthrew a system that had complete disrespect for human rights and for human dignity, and we needed to be pioneering that in how we address migration, our foreign policy on the African continent, and unfortunately, I don't think that that's what we are seeing specifically with respect to refugees and migrants. I think enough has been spoken about the statistics. I'm not going to speak about that. I think if we're going to look at migration in South Africa, if we're going to look at refugees coming to our country, we have to look at what's happening with the civil war in Syria, what's happening with the question of South Sudan, what's happening in the DRC. These are all issues that must inform the quality of decision-making that takes place in South Africa when we are assessing when people come through and with claims of declaring that they are refugees. And just generally, I think our foreign policy, it's not about promoting peace and respect for human rights and respect for human dignity on the continent. We don't see that in the way in which what's happening in the DRC. What intervention, what public intervention is there from South Africa in those conflicts? What we called for, Lawyers for Human Rights together with the Legal Resources Center made a submission on the green paper, and the white paper doesn't appear to have taken into account any of these. And in our submission, what we called for, and I think Jo spoke to this extensively in one of what she thinks we need to be doing more, is we need more, the government, the Department of Home Affairs. We know that Stats South Africa does a very good job of this, but it needs to be done in the context of the policies that we have and how we're implementing the activities and our programs, is annual statistics and reports on migration system, including both immigration and asylum statistics. We want factual, substantiated statistics, not millions coming into our country. And we want this to be with a baseline survey, impact of our, all the measures and the effectiveness of our policy. Because someone did mention we have brilliant policies, but they are not implemented and they're not enforced. And instead, what we're seeing is that law enforcement, whether it's immigration law enforcement, the police, are extremely xenophobic in how they manage and implement these policies. The questions that we had in areas of concern is expanding this policy and guidelines regarding SADC and the visa that was spoken about. We are concerned that there's no political will to actually enforce this. A SADC visa would address the questions that Jo spoke about in terms of what is the migration in the region. There's circular migration. People are not coming to live here. There's movement for needs of trade. There's issues of livelihood. That doesn't mean that you come and live in South Africa. And if we had a documentation process that legalizes this movement and doesn't instead force people to go underground, that would then promote more trade in the region. It will lead to development. And that's the approach that we would presume our government should be taking, as opposed to ones of bordering and restrictions and deportation and harassment of foreign nationals coming into our country. Then we want to, the key question on the amendments to the refugee bill, which we are seriously concerned about, is the question of the right to work. I think all of you know that refugees coming into our country get no support from the government or the UNHCR, and there's the very progressive policy of urban integration. And urban integration means that you must be able to survive. You must be able to work, you must be able to, in order for your survival. But more importantly, what was won in court, a ruling called Wachanuka, which ruled that the right to work is not only about survival, it's intrinsically linked to the respect for human dignity. And that's incredibly important for our courts to have made that ruling in enforcing our constitution. And yet we see now that the government is, in our policies, we are going to remove that right to work of asylum seekers. And we are concerned about the automatic detention that's taking place, but also from our own experience, there's a restriction. We have been prevented from monitoring, for example, the Musina police detention holding centers where migrants are being detained. And that's unlawful. international law demands that you actually allow access for monitoring and oversight to ensure that there's no infringements of human rights, and we have a history of that. I think people have spoken about these camps, the so-called processing centers, and there's serious questions around this. There's no indication of how these are going to be resourced. In fact, it's just made vague references that UNHCR, which has in writing said that they're not going to be doing that while they are an implementing partners, but we have not in any way indicated that we're going to be taking responsibility for this. So, I think it's in keeping with Australia, US under Trump, South Africa is going the same way, and I think that we do need to challenge these. I think it's important that civil society organizations, that we unite to ensure that the way in which we manage refugees, migrants in our country is in keeping with our constitution and what many people died for, the ultimately respect for human dignity and human rights. Thank you very much.